It's my delight on a personal level, professional level, former colleague, to invite this evening's lecturer, Professor Liz Prettejohn from the University of York, sometime at the parish of Plymouth, and also where I worked, the parish of Bristol, to give this evening's lecture. Liz is American, who studied at Harvard before coming over to work at the Courtauld Institute. She's held curatorial roles and continued to do academic-orientated curation as well, including, I think, you're heavily involved in the forthcoming Burne-Jones at the Tate, which is on its way. And has been a kind of an active co-curator looking specifically in the realm of British art in the late 18th through the 19th century, the Victorian aesthetics movement, and specifically focusing on aspects of the Pre-Raphaelites. So this concern with reception, the relation between philosophical aesthetics and art practice, looking at the likes of Walter Pater, Roger Fry, are a key concern, and Italy figures large within that story, the correlation between the Italian artistic cultural tradition and the English encounter, which is a long story. It obviously has Roman roots, but runs very strongly through the Grand Tour and that engagement. And then the increasing commercialization, if you like, or the shift of the Grand Tour to mass tourism, and how that also impacted upon the arts and upon the commissioning of arts. Liz's list of publications is inevitably lengthy and august, for the modernity of ancient sculptures, Greek sculpture and modern art from Winckelmann to Picasso, the Cambridge Companion to the Pre-Raphaelites, which is a marvellous volume, Art for Art's Sake, Aestheticism in Victorian Painting, and Liz is currently working on a volume to arise out of the 2011, I think it was, Paul Mellon lecture series at the National Gallery, on English Renaissance, the English Renaissance of art. Sorry, collapsing the Renaissance with the 19th century, but that's the relationship that's being examined. So again, looking at Rossetti, looking at Burne-Jones, looking at Whistler, Millet, and Leighton. So it's a great pleasure and a suitably august and anticipatory crowd to welcome you today to give the lecture Modern Painters and Old Masters, the Pre-Raphaelites and Italy. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Steve, for that really lovely introduction, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight. It really is a special pleasure for me to speak in relation to the British School at Rome, which ties in so many interesting ways with my research and with all of the things I love, and I think that will be evident in the course of today's talk. I'd like to first consider an example. In 1874, the National Gallery acquired this strange painting. Try to imagine you've never seen this painting before, and you don't know anything about it, and you'll see what I mean by calling it strange. First, there's the colorless floor or ground on which the figures are standing or kneeling. Should we interpret these blank patches as areas of unfinished canvas? Or does the picture show us a landscape to which we're unaccustomed in England's green and rainy land? A dry, dusty, colorless landscape with just a few dark green shrubs and scrappy grass. There we are. In the background to the left, we can see a range of mountains with the same bare or barren look. The sky, also reflected in the winding river, is similarly pale, yet full of light. Then there are the figures, each of them self-contained, not looking at one another, caught or frozen as they gesture or open their mouths to sing. We behold them at a particular moment in time, but it is not a fleeting or transient moment, as in an impressionist painting. Nothing is moving or changing. We feel that the musical chord being sounded by these singers and their instruments may go on forever. Their heads are on a level, pale in complexion and uniform in feature, each with its beads around the neck and its aureole of golden curls. The draperies are gathered into serpentine folds at the hip, then fall in a highly formalized pattern, vertical over the weight-bearing leg and spiraling over the slightly bent free leg, to left on the leftmost figure, to right on the right one. Their bare feet are pale too, as they stand on that strange ground in rhythmic alternation. 3 pairs of feet stand forward with 2 pairs behind, and the leftmost pair of feet advances slightly ahead of the rest. The pattern of feet doesn't quite match the heads above. While there is a conceptual alternation between heads forward, back, and forward again, the crowns of the heads, the eyes, the lips are aligned on the horizontal. Space and time are both important in this painting, but they do not work quite as they would in our everyday experience of the real world. The same with weight and volume. Heads, thighs, and feet appear perfectly rounded, and yet, like the 2 lutes and the violin, they present their widest surfaces to view, almost, although not quite, flat to the picture plane. No wonder this picture was not altogether easy for audiences to appreciate when it first appeared at the National Gallery in 1874. But it must have captured the imagination of the painter Edward Burne-Jones, who, in 1877, just 3 years later, exhibited a series of watercolor paintings clearly inspired by it. Indeed, Burne-Jones is so inspired that he seems compelled to imitate the old master painting. Let's take the second to last image in the series to see just how close the imitation is. Here, Burne-Jones has 5 figures, like the group of music-making figures to the left of the old painting, and he aligns their heads the same way, forward, back, with curly hair, eyes, and lips on a level. He loves the bare feet, too, and imitates their alternating pattern. He loves them so much that he imitates them again by placing them on a reflective surface and showing their rounded volumes once more in vertical reversal. He also imitates the deadpan expressions and the color chord, blonde, blue, gold. Burne-Jones is fascinated by the way the figures in the old master painting repeat each other, or we might say, imitate each other. And that perhaps gives the cue for the larger conception of Burne-Jones's series of imitations, and indeed for its subject matter, the days of creation, each of which imitates the previous one. So we have on the left the first day of creation, with a single angel holding a sphere showing the creation of light and its division from darkness. Then the second day with 2 angels and a second sphere showing the creation of the firmament of heaven. The third day with 3 angels and a third sphere showing the creation of the dry land with its trees and herbs, and so on. The spheres seem to be inspired by the lutes in the old master painting, and perhaps they retain something of the meaning of those shapes in their previous context. They evoke the idea of the music of the spheres, combining that idea with the story of the creation. The transformation of the flat front surfaces of the lutes into the ideal 3-dimensionality of the spheres also responds visually to what Burne-Jones is learning from the old painting, to its exploration from first principles of the difference between 2 and 3 dimensions. In one sense, that's an art historical problem, and certainly Burne-Jones is interested in what's going on in the early painting, the way the painter of the 15th century is inventing or originating a way of showing 3-dimensional volume on a 2-dimensional surface. But that relationship between 2 and 3 dimensions is also a fundamental problem for modern art, from Impressionism through Cubism to total abstraction. Burne-Jones's series of watercolors reminds us of a link we might have forgotten about with all our talk of modernist originality, the link between the exploration of the art of the past and the creation of a modern art. It can't be a coincidence that Burne-Jones conducts this exploration of pictorial first principles through a series of paintings that represent the creation of the world. That reminds us that the old master painting by Piero della Francesca also represents a kind of creation, a nativity, the creation of human life in the New Testament, parallel to the original creation of the world in the book of Genesis. As I've been hinting, Piero della Francesca's work was not well known, and his was not a famous name when the National Gallery acquired their picture of the Nativity. To observers in 1874, it looked strange. Indeed, it looked immature or underdeveloped in relation to the more familiar masterpieces of the High Renaissance. But Burne-Jones saw something more in it, and that generated the possibility of new artistic creation in which ideas from the old master painting are transformed into new ideas for a modern work of art. A standard view, one that you'll find in some form in any textbook on modern art, is that modern painting requires a break with the past in order to assert its own originality. But our example seems to show the opposite. The way to be truly original is to engage as closely as possible with the art of the past, so closely that I'm calling it imitation. Now, I expect some of you have been wondering why I've only been showing you 5 vertical watercolors by Burne-Jones. You're right. There ought to be 6 days of creation. And indeed there were when Burne-Jones first showed this work at the inaugural exhibition of the new and glamorous exhibiting venue, the Grosvenor Gallery in London in 1877. Here is an old photograph of the whole ensemble in its massive frame, like an Italian Renaissance altarpiece. This exhibition marked Burne-Jones's return to the London exhibition scene after a 7-year period when he'd been almost invisible in public, and it made a huge splash. From then on, as Henry James put it, a Grosvenor Gallery exhibition without Burne-Jones was like a performance of Shakespeare's Hamlet with Hamlet left out. The subsequent story makes a fascinating example of the vicissitudes in the taste for Victorian paintings in the century and a half since then. After the First World War and the stock market crash, the art market plummeted, and the fortunes of the Victorian artists were particularly badly affected. So the next generations thought that the Victorian paintings looked outdated or even embarrassing, the kind of thing your most tiresome old uncle had on the wall. They were no longer modern painters and not yet old masters, just old-fashioned. However, this set of Burne-Jones watercolors was acquired by an enterprising American collector, Grenville Winthrop, who didn't care about fashion and got an amazing bargain as a result. In 1943, he left his entire collection to the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard University, where they didn't know what to do with a set of 6 unfashionable Burne-Joneses. By then, they'd probably already lost the massive frame too big to store. The museum lent the 6 watercolors, now in individual frames, to one of the Harvard houses. That's the Harvard equivalent of an Oxbridge College. In this case, Dunster House, which I have to admit was my own house as an undergraduate at Harvard. In 1970, the 4th day disappeared from where it was hanging in the Dunster House dining hall. Now the only record of the 4th day is a black and white photograph, and the series is incomplete. Maybe some unscrupulous but art-loving Dunster House alumnus still has the 4th day squirreled away somewhere. Not me, I hasten to say, since I didn't go up to university until 1978. And at that date, we didn't even look at the Victorian paintings in Grenville Winthrop's collection. They were relegated to the storerooms, or worse, the back stairs at the Fogg, where we students used to knock our rucksacks and book bags against them on the way to class. Now the whirligig of fashion has turned round again, and Victorian and Pre-Raphaelite paintings are among the most popular, given pride of place in the new displays at the Fogg after its recent refurbishment. That's quite a familiar story about how Victorian art fell from favor, then rose again, and the roles of collectors like Grenville Winthrop, the art trade, and museum institutions like the Fogg have been crucial. But think back to the Piero, There we saw an equally dramatic change in taste, and again, the collectors, the art trade, and the museums made a big difference. In the 1870s, Pierrot's name was scarcely known, and people thought his work looked strange. But by the 1970s, when I went to Harvard, Pierrot was definitely in the top 10. Burne-Jones wasn't included in the Harvard art history course at that date, nor were any of the other Pre-Raphaelites, but Piero della Francesca most certainly was. My point here is that it's not just the collectors, the art trade, and the museums, or even art historians like me, who are responsible for reassessments of the art of the past. Artists such as Burne-Jones play a crucial role. I'd go even further and say that without Burne-Jones and the other artists of his generation, we probably still wouldn't know the name of Piero della Francesca or rate his work highly. So in this lecture, I'm arguing that the study of the old masters shaped the development of modern art, but I also want to tell the story of how modern artists have helped to shape our perceptions of the old masters. From its founding in 1901, the British School at Rome has had a crucial role to play in these relationships between modern art and the art of the past, also between British and Italian art. Just a quick example. Here's a wonderful photograph of the first woman to win a scholarship to the British School at Rome, Winifred Knights, in 1923 in her studio at the BSR. In the background, you can see a portion of the ambitious painting she was working on, The Marriage at Cana. Really an extraordinary achievement for any young artist at this date, 2 meters wide and almost that tall. In preparation for making this painting, Knights visited Arezzo to study Piero's Legend of the True Cross. And here I'm showing you the frescoes made in the 1450s that tell the story of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. And we can see Knights thinking about those serene volumetric figures and their grouping in her own work. Her imitation is as thoughtful as Burne-Jones's, although by her generations it's not as pioneering. By the 1920s, everyone thought that Piero della Francesca was a painter worth a young artist's study. So, Winifred Knights' work looks more obviously modernist, but Burne-Jones's can be considered more pioneering or groundbreaking. In both cases, though, the aesthetic impact depends on relationships between modern art and the art of the past. Also, relationships between British art and the art of Italy. These relationships are embedded in the history of the British School at Rome, and they're just as relevant today as they were when the BSR was founded in 1901. Indeed, I think they're now more important than ever. We'll come back to that point. But first, let's flash back to the beginning of the story. A good place to start is with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, that group of rebellious young artists formed in 1848, that year of European revolutions. They were a self-conscious avant-garde with a political edge, just what we expect to see in modern art. On the other hand, their self-appointed label, Pre-Raphaelite, implies that they were looking backward to the art of the past, the art of the period before Raphael. It's that paradox between a self-conscious modernity and a serious engagement with the art of the past that I want to explore. A point has been made with tiresome frequency that the young members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, they ranged in age from 19 to 23, knew nothing much about early Italian art. Certainly none of them had been to Italy when they banded together, and they didn't have much opportunity to study early Italian art in England either. We've just been seeing that Piero della Francesca was still an unknown quantity 20 years later. In fact, I've argued myself that the early painting the young artists knew best wasn't Italian at all, but rather Northern European, the painting of 1434 by Jan van Eyck, now known as the Arnolfini portrait, acquired by the National Gallery in 1842. Its oil painting technique and superb state of preservation were much discussed at the time the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was forming. Here are just a few of the paintings of the next half century that take up the motif of the circular mirror on the back wall, a sign or clue that the artists are thinking about the implications of Van Eyck's kind of art making. Quite a few of these works can be seen in the current exhibition at the National Gallery entitled Reflections, Van Eyck and the Pre-Raphaelites. That's on until the 2nd of April, and I do recommend that you see it if you haven't done so already. The exhibition shows how that one little painting in the National Gallery, Van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait, became the catalyst for a major development in modern art. Indeed, some Victorian critics noticed the young Pre-Raphaelites' interest in northern early Renaissance art and grumbled that they ought to be called pre-Rubensists or ante-Dürerites. But they had chosen the word Pre-Raphaelite, and the idea of early Italian art was important from the start, even if their actual experience of it was limited. At the time of the Brotherhood's formation, the National Gallery's holdings of early Italian art were limited to these works. An altarpiece by Francesco Francia with its lunette showing a Pietà, seen here on the left, the Madonna and Child by Perugino on the top right, and on bottom right, the two panel paintings of saints on a gold background, tentatively attributed to Giotto's pupil Taddeo Gaddi, although they're now given to Lorenzo Monaco. All of these were recent acquisitions. The Francia and the Perugino had entered the National Gallery collection in 1841, and the two goldbacks were the latest arrivals, presented to the gallery in 1848 almost simultaneously with the first discussions among the artists who would call themselves Pre-Raphaelite brothers. They were also the only really early paintings in the National Gallery collection at this point. They date from the first decade of the 15th century, quite a bit earlier than anything else in the collection apart from the Arnolfini portrait. The quality of the young artist's engagement with these early works may be more important than the quantity of paintings they knew, and I think it's possible to see the inspiration of the goldbacks in all the main works exhibited by the Pre-Raphaelites in the spring of 1849, the first exhibition season after the formation of the Brotherhood. John Everett Millet's Isabella on the top left, William Holman Hunt's Rienzi on the top right, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti's Girlhood of Mary Virgin on the bottom left. These details may make the point clearer. All three young artists seem particularly interested in the grouping of the pair of saints at right angles to one another on the right-hand panel. They're also interested in the individualized realism of the heads in the early Italian painting, and in the way the Italian artist composes the picture to give a clear view of each head in all its detail. Hunt, I think, has also studied the lunette by Francia that we saw a minute ago. He borrows the thin legs and the slight stiffness of the pose in Francia's Pietà to add poignancy to his own depiction of the pointless death of a boy and the start of a revolutionary movement. So, to repeat my first point, quality is more important than quantity, and already in their first exhibition season, we can see the young artists responding to the few early Italian paintings that were available to them for study. But they were also eager to see more, and immediately after their first exhibition season was over, Hunt and Rossetti rushed across the Channel to Paris and Belgium. They wanted to see contemporary art in Paris, and they wanted to see the art of the Northern Renaissance in both Paris and Belgium, but they also wanted to see early Italian art. And in the Louvre, they saw their first Fra Angelicos, Mantegnas, Leonardos, Giorgiones, and Botticellis. And here's the second point I want to make. Obviously, it's important to have occasion to see early Italian art, but it's equally important to have a strong idea about why that art might be of interest. On that trip, Rossetti wrote a sequence of sonnets about pictures that impressed him. The sonnets were published in the early months of 1850 in the Pre-Raphaelite little magazine, The Germ. They included two sonnets about a work by a living French artist, Ingres Roger freeing Angelica from the sea monster, 2 sonnets about paintings by Memling, or then attributed to Memling, that Rossetti saw in Bruges, and 2 about Italian paintings in the Louvre, Mantegna's Parnassus and the Concert Champêtre, then attributed to Giorgione. It's important to emphasize that none of these paintings was on the tourists' list of top sights to see. They're all distinctive and slightly quirky. Even more interesting, in retrospect, is a comment made later by Rossetti's brother, William. In 1849, when my brother with Holman Hunt first visited Paris, he observed in the Louvre with particular pleasure 1 or 2 pictures by Botticelli and talked about them on his return. Herbert Horn, the Botticelli scholar to whom William confided this reminiscence, suggested that Rossetti might have taken note of the Virgin and Child with St. John in the Louvre. That's conjecture, but we must take seriously Horn's comment that Rossetti was, quote, among the first to realize in some definite measure the peculiar character and charm of Botticelli's art. And this in 1849, about 2 decades before the much vaunted rediscovery of Botticelli in the writings of Algernon and Charles Swinburne, Walter Pater, and John Ruskin. Nor is that implausible. Rossetti was predisposed to have a fascination for Botticelli, known to have been the illustrator of Dante, Rossetti's namesake and the focus of his early experiments in poetry and translation. That is, to repeat my second point, the idea of Botticelli as the interpreter in visual form of Dante's poems was a powerful incentive to seek out his art, even though Botticelli's was in 1849 still a very obscure name indeed. In the next years, the Pre-Raphaelite artists began to travel more frequently to Italy, and indeed this was part of a more general development. Of course, Rome, as Stephen already mentioned, had always been a place of pilgrimage for artists, the cynosure and final destination of the grand tour, and a place to linger, funds permitting, to draw and study for extended periods. But travel was changing, and particularly after Italian unification, it was increasingly possible to move easily through Italy and, on relatively short and affordable trips, to see a much wider range of cities and towns and the art within them. Cheaper transport was a factor, but even more important was increasing freedom of movement and the easing of border controls. Indeed, those factors are, I think, the only way to explain the dramatic increase in travel to all parts of Italy from the end of the 1850s onwards, something that had a much more important impact on the development of modern art than the scholarly literature as yet acknowledged. John Ruskin was independently wealthy and already an experienced Italian traveler. He encouraged and sometimes financed the Italian travels of many artists, including Burne-Jones. The Rossetti family was a special case because the father, Gabriele Rossetti, was a political exile. They'd been nervous about visiting Italy, but William Michael Rossetti took the first opportunity to go to Italy when the political situation permitted in 1860, and then returned frequently. There's much more to say about this wider development. In my view, it's impossible to overstate the extent to which the flourishing of modern art from the 1860s onwards was enabled by freedom of movement and the easing of border controls throughout Europe, and particularly in Italy. And that applies to artists who came from all over the world. That's a much larger story that needs to be further researched. But let's concentrate for now on the Pre-Raphaelites and travel to Florence, where they began increasingly to take note of Botticelli. Edward Burne-Jones in 1859, William Michael Rossetti in 1860, Algernon and Charles Swinburne in 1864, John Everett Millais in 1865, when Walter Pater also made his first visit to Florence in Italy, then Simeon Solomon in 1866-7, and Walter Crane in 1871. All of them paid special attention to Botticelli when it was still unusual to do so. The gregarious Pre-Raphaelite artists and poets may then have played a larger role in spreading the word about Botticelli than the scholarly literature has yet acknowledged. Interestingly, many of the Pre-Raphaelites were particularly struck by the Primavera, which Swinburne described as the beautiful and battered picture. It wasn't in good condition and had been difficult to see earlier in the century, so it remained less well known than the Birth of Venus. However, Burne-Jones drew from the painting on his first Italian journey in 1859, and it made a particularly powerful impression on Millet in 1865. Millet, I think, cannot have been aware of the Primavera back in the later 1850s when he painted his own large multifigural painting of Spring. But he must have experienced an uncanny shock of recognition or affinity with the 15th century artist when he finally saw the Primavera in 1865. Surely, though, the reference to Botticelli's Primavera is deliberate and carefully meditated in this painting by Simeon Solomon, who inscribed the word Florence next to the date, 1866, as though to emphasize the point that he's making the work on the spot in Florence, where he can observe the work of Botticelli directly. Perhaps he also acknowledges that his own work is late coming. Solomon's figure represents love in autumn rather than spring, and he also conflates or condenses a reference to the figures of Zephyr and the nymph on the right in the Primavera with a reversed version of the leftmost figures of the wind and nymph in the Birth of Venus. We can see an interest in the same pairs of figures by Botticelli in a watercolor by Burne-Jones on a subject from Ovid's Heroides, Phyllis and Demophoon of 1870. Here there's also a reversal of gender to parallel the reversal in orientation of the two figures at the right of the Primavera. Phyllis, the female figure, is the pursuer of the male Demophoon, vulnerable in his nudity. And reminiscent as well of the figure of love in the painting by Solomon. These artists are exploring the complexities of human relationships, love, and sexuality in these figures where gender may shift and desire may go unfulfilled. It's easy to point to the autobiographical resonances for both artists at this date, when Solomon was exploring his homosexuality and Burne-Jones his passion for a woman not his wife, Maria Zambaco, whose facial features are often said to have inspired those of Phyllis in the watercolor. At the same time, both artists are also exploring the complex relationships of their own art to the art of the past. Since the Renaissance, a common strategy for artistic imitation has been the reversal of pose or figural orientation, as discussed in a famous essay of E.H. Gombrich. Solomon and Burne-Jones are also, of course, pointing out Botticelli's imitation of himself in the two great Florentine allegories. It's important to note that at this date, there was no scholarly consensus about the identification of the figures in the Botticelli paintings or about the wider significance of the allegorical subjects. In a sense, Solomon and Burne-Jones are carrying out art historical research when they re-examine these mysterious figures in their own work. Dante Gabriel Rossetti was less brave than his brother, and although he often planned to visit Italy, he was never quite able to bring himself to go. He seems to have discovered what the Primavera looked like only from a large photograph sent him in 1879, when his response was a triumphant flash of recognition. In a letter to Jane Morris, he writes, "Isn't Ned Jones's Phyllis and Demophoon just about as plain as a pikestaff in one corner? Isn't it just?" Thus, Rossetti instantly recognized what modern scholars have only recently rediscovered, Burne-Jones's imitation of Botticelli in this watercolor. Perhaps that's only to be expected. The exploration of Botticelli's art that became a shared project in the Pre-Raphaelite circle by the end of the 1860s had probably been sparked to begin with by Rossetti's initial interest in Botticelli as the illustrator of Dante. Although Botticelli himself, Rossetti could never bring himself to visit Italy, the mountain came to Muhammad, so to speak, when Rossetti seized a lucky opportunity to buy a portrait by Botticelli at auction in 1867 for the astonishingly low price of 20 guineas. It's the portrait now in the V&A and known as Smeralda Bandinelli. Once again, quality proved more important than quantity for Rossetti, and his study of this single painting by Botticelli had a profound impact on his own later work. It's often said that the period from the late 1860s to Rossetti's death in 1882 was dominated by his obsession with the figure of Jane Morris, but it would be equally true to say that the period was dominated by his obsession with the portrait by Botticelli, or rather, that Rossetti's twin devotions to Jane Morris and to Botticelli were inseparable, from La Pia de Ptolemy, designed in 1868 and seen here on the top left, through to the Daydream, one of Rossetti's last pictures of 1880 on the bottom left, and including the multiple versions of Proserpine, one of which we see on the right of this slide. Rossetti explores everything about the Botticelli from the moment he takes possession of it. Under its influence, he abruptly shifts from the half-length figures of his practice in the earlier 1860s to three-quarter-length figures, more distanced, both physically and psychologically, than the overtly sexy half-lengths. He experiments again and again with the rippling folds of the diaphanous overgarment. He rings the changes on the mannered hands with their long fingers. And above all, he strives for the balance in the Botticelli head between the unflinching eyes and the prominent lips. The crucial example is Rossetti's Dante subject, La Donna della Finestra, dated 1879 but designed as early as 1870. Here is an imitation so close that it even repeats what a drawing master might consider the faults of the prototype: the too sharp angle at which the window pane recedes on the right, the non-matching perspective of the other wall, and the way the figure overcrowds its space. But the intellectual meaning of the picture requires this complete visual dependence. Through it, the instantly recognizable Jane Morris, beloved of Rossetti, becomes Botticelli's sitter, who, Rossetti persuaded himself, was also the model for the central figure in the Primavera, as significant a person in Botticelli's life as Jane Morris in his own. But that's not all. She is also Dante's woman at the window, who looks down at Dante with pity after the death of Beatrice. And Rossetti's painting brings together the character from Dante and the visual image from Botticelli. It gives visible form to the idea of Botticelli as the illustrator of Dante, and in a sense raises the stakes by discovering it again in the living body of the modern-day woman, Jane Morris. So Rossetti's interest in Botticelli was a deeply personal one. Indeed, one that united with uncanny thoroughness his deepest loves for Dante in poetry, for early Renaissance in visual art, and for Jane Morris in real life. And he was even able to make Botticelli part of his own household, so to speak, when he took possession of the portrait of Smeralda Bandinelli. But this utterly private obsession had an entirely public parallel in the extraordinary rise in Botticelli's critical fortunes over the same period. When Rossetti sold his portrait in 1880, he received 300 guineas for it, 15 times what he'd paid for it 13 years earlier. As he put it in a letter to Jane Morris, "The idea of selling pictures you don't have to paint is certainly a very great one." Admittedly, the original auction price was probably something of a fluke, but the appreciation in value is notable nonetheless, and it marks a rise in Botticelli's status just as spectacular as that in Piero della Francesca's, which we observed earlier. Botticelli makes a textbook case. The subject of the exhibition, Botticelli Reimagined, seen at the V&A in the Gemälde Gallery in Berlin a couple of years ago. As the exhibition showed, Botticelli attracted astonishingly little critical attention for the 3.5 centuries after his death. His work belongs to an awkward in-between period at the end of the 15th century, and it wasn't easy to classify him either as a typical early Renaissance artist like Fra Angelico, or as a typical high Renaissance artist like Raphael. So critics, if they mentioned him at all, tended to see him as merely of historical or antiquarian interest. They described his coloring as dry and his drawing as quaint or Gothic, as if he hadn't quite graduated to the mature Renaissance realism of a Raphael. Then, in 1868, the poet Algernon Charles Swinburne published an article on Old Master drawings in the Uffizi collection in which he reinterpreted these qualities. For Swinburne, Botticelli's work no longer seemed deficient in maturity or realism. Rather, it was fascinating for its strangeness or fantasy. And in 1870, Walter Pater took up the hint in his article on Botticelli, the first article on the artist in any language. Here, Pater proposes a new interpretation of Botticelli's Birth of Venus. He acknowledges the old reservations about Botticelli's quaintness, but he turns this into a virtue. The light is indeed cold, mere sunless dawn, but a later painter would have cloyed you with sunshine, and you can see the better for that quietness in the morning air, each long promontory as it slopes down to the water's edge. Men go forth to their labors until the evening, but she is awake before them, and you might think that the sorrow in her face was at the thought of the whole long day of love yet to come. That same year, the Arundel Society published a chromolithograph of Botticelli's Birth of Venus, making it widely available in color reproduction. And in the 1870s, the National Gallery went all out to acquire important works by Botticelli, including these now familiar examples. This, then, is a textbook example of how an artistic rediscovery may percolate through from critical or historical writing to reproduction and museum collecting. But we shouldn't forget the artistic responses. Pater drew special attention to what he called the emblematical figure of the wind on the left of the Birth of Venus. Perhaps it was his painter friends who gave him that idea, for, as we've already seen, that figure was of special importance to both Solomon and Burne-Jones in the years immediately before the publication of Pater's essay. I've already suggested that I think the catalyst was Rossetti's interest in Botticelli as the illustrator of Dante, and even though he stayed at home in London, Rossetti remained central to the story. We've seen that he knew the Primavera only from a photograph. I think that probably would have been a technologically advanced photograph for its date, 1879, but it was, of course, in black and white. With characteristic imperiousness, he commanded the friend who procured the photograph to come to his house and explain the colors to him, so he could write a sonnet for Spring by Sandro Botticelli. And that sonnet haunted the imaginations of the next generation of critics and art historians. It's quoted conspicuously in the major scholarly works on Botticelli, Abbe Warburg's dissertation of 1893 and Herbert Horn's learned monograph of 1908. Both Warburg and Horn later became more ambivalent about Pre-Raphaelite art, but it's hard not to see in Warburg's key phrase, bewegtes Beiwerk, accessories in motion, an echo of his youthful enthusiasm for Burne-Jones. And I'm showing you some accessories in motion in works by Burne-Jones. Just for interest, this is Simeon Solomon's pencil drawing of his friend Walter Pater, which ended up in the collection of Herbert Horn. On the bottom left of the sheet are both Solomon's monograph and Horn's collection stamp. So we can trace the lineage from the artist Solomon, the younger friend of Rossetti, who admired Botticelli's paintings in Florence in the mid-1860s, to his friend Pater, who wrote his pioneering essay on Botticelli in 1870, to Horn, who published his definitive monograph on Botticelli, inspired by Rossetti, Solomon, and Pater in 1908. So I am arguing that this period was the great era for revaluing the painting of these old masters, for making them matter to the modern world. That's not, of course, because the paintings of such as Van Eyck, Botticelli, or Piero hadn't been available in previous centuries. Of course they were. But little attention was paid to them. They didn't seem particularly wonderful or marvelous until artists and writers made them compelling. Oscar Wilde comments explicitly on this process in his dialogue, The Critic as Artist. Things are because we see them, and what we see and how we see it depends on the arts that have influenced us. One does not see a thing until one sees its beauty. Then, and then only, does it come into existence. At present, people see fogs, not because there are fogs, but because poets and painters have taught them the mysterious loveliness of such effects. There may have been fogs for centuries in London, I dare say there were, but no one saw them, and so we do not know anything about them. They did not exist till art had invented them. And to illustrate Wilde's point, I'm showing you some London fogs of the 1870s by Claude Monet and James McNeill Whistler. In addition to the influence of the old masters on modern artists, we must acknowledge the influence of the modern artists on how we see the old masters. To paraphrase Wilde, the old masters did not exist, or at least no one saw them, until modern art had invented them. Now, I've been concentrating on British painting, but you can observe the same developments going on at the same time all over Europe, and notably in Paris in the circle of Edouard Manet, where there's interest in some of the same old masters. Here, for example, is Rossetti's Fazio's Mistress of 1863, juxtaposed with the painting by Titian in the Louvre that surely inspired it. Here, I'm showing you a comparison that's much more familiar in art history textbooks between Manet's Olympia of 1863, exactly the same date as Rossetti's Fazio's Mistress, and another Titian, the Venus of Urbino. The French theorist Michel Foucault has this to say about the art of Manet. Déjeuner sur l'herbe and Olympia were perhaps the first museum paintings, the first paintings in European art that were an acknowledgement of the new and substantial relationship of painting to itself as a manifestation of the existence of museums and the particular reality and interdependence that paintings acquire in museums. I'm showing you on the left Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, together with the Concert Champêtre of the Louvre, attributed to either Titian or Giorgione at various times. Art historians have generally considered the development of French avant-garde painting quite separately from what was going on in Victorian England at the same moment. But that painting by Titian or Giorgione links the two art worlds. We've seen that Rossetti wrote a haunting sonnet on the picture when he first visited the Louvre in 1849, and it continued to inspire British as well as French painters. Here's just one example, Burne-Jones's Le Chant d'Amour of 1865 alongside Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe. The French and British artists draw different implications from the Venetian Renaissance painting. Manet emphasizes the shock effect of presenting a nude female figure together with clothed male figures, whereas Burne-Jones explores the idea of rapt attention to music. You won't find this comparison in art history textbooks, and it doesn't assort with standard accounts of the history of modern art. To eyes trained in the 20th century, the Manet is so obviously modernist and the Burne-Jones so traditionalist. Or are they? Both artistic projects, French and English, can be seen as responses to an artistic problem felt to be urgently modern. In Foucault's words, the new and substantial relationship of art to itself. And in this context, British and French painters were working together much more closely than the art history textbooks have yet acknowledged. Just as old master collecting, dealing, and scholarship were matters of international exchange and sometimes of rivalry, so was the exploration of the art of the past in the creation of a modern art. Sometimes the Pre-Raphaelites and their followers have been described as insular or Little Englandish, but nothing could be further from the truth. When they chose the name Pre-Raphaelite, they were declaring their ambition to be part of the history of European art. and their influence on the subsequent development of modern art in Europe was much greater than the art history books would give us to believe. There isn't time to make that argument in detail today, and indeed, our art history is so immured in its national schools that we don't have the empirical materials yet to make the argument properly. But I'd like to conclude with a final work by Burne-Jones that could certainly sustain such an argument. The Wheel of Fortune, now in the Musée d'Orsay, Paris, and that's not an accident. This monumental painting, 2 meters high, was first seen at the Grosvenor Gallery in London in 1883 and immediately attracted the attention of French critics and artists. Pierre Puvis de Chavannes begged Burne-Jones to exhibit it at the Société Nationale des Beaux-Arts in the Champ de Mars, the artist-led alternative to the official salon, in 1892. That didn't work out, but in 1895, the painting was shown at the Exposition des Beaux-Arts in Brussels. A few years later, the Belgian artist Fernand Knopf placed a reproduction of it on the chimney breast in the White Room of his innovative studio house in Brussels. And the painting itself was acquired in 1932 by the Vicomte and Vicomtesse de Noailles, Parisian patrons of avant-garde film, surrealist art, and composers such as Poulenc and Auric. In their collection, the Wheel of Fortune joined works by Picasso, Dali, Mondrian, de Chirico, Klee, and a host of surrealists. The Musée d'Orsay bought the Burne-Jones from the Noailles' daughter in 1980. I mention these details to show that even in the middle of the 20th century, when the taste for Pre-Raphaelite art is supposed to have been at its lowest ebb, it was at home with the art of Europe in this great collection of modern art. The composition derives from one small predella panel at the bottom left of this design for The Story of Troy, a never-completed project, based on the classical story of the Trojan War, filtered through its retellings in medieval literature, and given the form of a Renaissance altarpiece in general configuration like Mantegna's San Zeno altarpiece in Verona, embellished, as Burne-Jones's studio assistant Thomas Rook remarked, with garlands and details in the manner of Crivelli, the 15th century Italian painter collected particularly avidly by the National Gallery in the 1860s. This classical, indeed pagan, story, filtered through medieval literature and given the shape and form of a Renaissance altarpiece, becomes a modern work of art. The whole thing is impossibly complex. No wonder it wasn't finished. But you can find traces of all its aspects in The Wheel of Fortune. The composition derives from late medieval manuscripts, and here are two 15th century examples, French and English, that Burne-Jones might have known. Burne-Jones preserves the scale and gender relationships between the full-scale allegorical female figure of Fortune and the small male figures bound to the wheel. Indeed, he accentuates the dizzying shift in scale between the colossal wheel and the glimpses of building and scenery far below, a sublime effect. Unlike the sturdy wooden wheels of the manuscripts, Burne-Jones's wheel is of polished metal, industrial scale, machine-tooled with precision engineering, and thus in sharp contrast to the fragments of old architecture glimpsed through the interstices, vestiges perhaps of a handcrafted past. The manuscripts typically place a crowned king at the top of the wheel, even if that is only to illustrate his supremacy pro tempore. But in Burne-Jones's painting, a slave is on top, trampling the king's crown with his foot. Ruskin, commenting on this picture, quoted the line from the Magnificat: "He hath put down the mighty from their seat, and hath exalted the humble and meek." Below the king is a poet with laurel wreath. Is this a sardonic comment on the rank or destiny of the artist in the world of temporal affairs? On a trip to Italy in 1871, Burne-Jones made drawings after the unfinished sculptures known as Slaves by Michelangelo in the Accademia in Florence, and he lay on his back in the Sistine Chapel to study Michelangelo's frescoed ceiling. The heroic nudes of Michelangelo clearly inspire the figures on the wheel, and there may be echoes of the Sistine Sibyls in the figure of Fortune. Frederick George Stevens, the pre-Raphaelite brother, now turned art critic, saw the head of Michelangelo's sculpture Night in Burne-Jones's figure of Fortune, and perhaps the cap is also Michelangelesque or Leonardesque, though the draperies look like a complex amalgam of Botticelli and Mantegna. Burne-Jones manages to weave together a bewilderingly diverse set of prototypes, each of which is thoroughly transformed in the process. The composition of a miniature illustration becomes a monumental painting 2 meters high. The powerful musculature of Michelangelo's slaves attains finito, highly refined finish, freeing themselves from the sculptural block only to writhe on the wheel. The headdresses and draperies of Botticelli or Leonardo, with their intricate knotting and folding, seem to turn to steel. This mixture of inspirations and influences is no longer pre-Raphaelite, and despite its fascinating reminiscences of earlier works of art, it looks like nothing ever made before. Burne-Jones's friend Francis Horner recalled that he once said, "I was born in a little city of the Apennines, and my name was Eduardo della Francesca, but afterwards, Buongiorno, for the welcome that was given me." But he was not an Italian of the 15th century. He was born in industrial Birmingham in 1833, and he was a modern painter through and through. As I've been arguing, he was a modern painter most of all in the sophistication of his awareness of the old masters. And after a period in which his art was undervalued, perhaps for that very reason, it's now in the ascendant again. But the story isn't just about the whirligig of fashion or the latest turn of the wheel of fortune. Nor is it just about the need to reevaluate and reassess the art of the past with every new generation. It's about keeping art alive, so that Michelangelo and Piero and Mantegna and Botticelli remain just as vital, just as modern for us as the latest name to hit the headlines. As a teacher, I worry sometimes about the overwhelming dominance of recent and contemporary art in today's media and therefore in the experience of the younger generations. If Rossetti and Burne-Jones were right, and I think they were, we need to value the art of the past if we are to get a vital art in the present. And we won't get the most out of either the old masters or the modern painters unless we keep them both in play.
Thank you for an electric lecture. I'm sorry about that interference. We did actually switch the sound off when we had the problem, but it still kept going, so I don't know what the problem is. Hopefully it'll go away. There is time for questions if you're happy to take some. So if you want to retake the stage, we have switched it back on, we have a roving mic with Jess, so if people do have questions that they'd like to ask Liz, please do raise a hand and we will come and find you.
We got one. Embarrassing question. But why
No
Raphael?
question. Why Raphael? I mean, that's actually, it's very interesting. As Raphael, he's like an interesting sort of pivot point. For the people who loved early art, he's sort of the culmination of the whole tradition that arose and developed through the 15th century. And for those people who absolutely loved high Renaissance art and wanted to reject the early masters, Raphael's still okay because he's the representative of the great high Renaissance generation after 1500. So he's interestingly able to function on both sides as a sort of a great artist. And I think it's the big name of Raphael that's one of the reasons the Pre-Raphaelite artists want to sort of get him into their title. It's the idea of pushing against Raphael is the thing that's most likely to get everybody's attention. The word is, of course, not pre-Raphael art, although some critics sometimes printed it that way, possibly in order to make a little bit of a dig at the Pre-Raphaelites. But the word is actually Pre-Raphaelite, by which, as the artists explained later, they meant that their objection was not to Raphael himself, but to the Raphaelites, the students and followers and all the people who imitated Raphael. So what they objected to was the sort of ossification or petrification of the ideas of Raphael in the later art of followers and imitators. One thing that I think is really remarkable is how that rather complicated term caught on at all, Pre-Raphaelite. It's actually hard even to sort of say. And yet, somehow, it's become the sort of greatest brand name in British art, the one that everybody knows, even though the idea is complex and the word is complicated. Does that answer your... Okay.
Who was first? It's not so much a question, but a comment. And I found it really fascinating to see how important it was in this early period for people to have access to pictures. And as a Proustian fan, it's something you get very strongly in à la recherche. And I wonder what the effect is going to be in the present generations, when actually, colour images are just everywhere. You say that it's difficult because the modern images are common, but in fact, of course, even the ancient images are easy to come by. You just use Wikipedia and you've got whatever you want really from somewhere. And in a way, there seems to be a risk that there'll be no sort of shock of the new, of the excitement of discovering a sort of completely different area in the past. And that may have an interesting effect. I wondered if you had any thoughts on what sort of effect that might have on the way art will progress in the future.
Yeah, I have a lot of, in terms of the historical situation, it's very interesting to try to work out what the artist did have access to, and of course you find there are a lot more channels than you realize, and sometimes you sort of think, how can that artist have known something, and then you work out that his friend had been to the gallery and had made a drawing and so forth. So that in fact we need to remember that we only know the minimum usually in relation to historic artists, and their familiarity with things is probably much wider than we really realize. I'm not that worried yet about the proliferation of images on the internet. At the moment, what I see among students and indeed among people I hear from all over the world is an enormous excitement about precisely that, discovering all kinds of things that they didn't know. I mean, the Art UK website has opened up an amazing variety of things that nobody was looking at and didn't know they existed, and now one finds that people are amazingly knowledgeable and amazingly adventurous about looking at all kinds of things. And at the moment, I'm really actually quite optimistic that this proliferation of things will give people more chance to explore and experiment. But I don't think it's special to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. I think it's very much, as I've been trying to indicate, a feature of the art worlds all over the world, in fact. To an extent, you can probably point to this in any historical situation if you pay attention to it. But in the middle 19th century, there is a kind of I think there's a raising of the stakes in a sense, partly because of museum creation and museum collecting, which is these great collections. I mean, I've highlighted the National Gallery, but there's lots of them. Great collections that are being formed, and this is, I mean, it's newsworthy. You get it, you know, you get that it makes headlines when things are discovered and invented. So I do think there's a sort of a special friction that happens that has great sort of creative results. I also think that in this group of painters, there's something special going on, that they actually want to look at artists who are not canonical. So I think in the way artists were trained in earlier periods, there was more of an emphasis on looking at the masters that were in the top 10, looking at Raphael, for example. And these artists are actually, they're trying to learn about art and about what they might be able to do by working through the styles of artists who are genuinely unknown and who might or might not make it. They don't know at this date that Botticelli will become famous or that Piero will become famous, and these things, obviously, the two things become intertwined, the study of the old master artist and the practice of the modern painter. So I do think there's something that's special about this moment in history.
Thank you. I heard two really important things in what you've said, particularly in relation to Foucault's idea of art in relation to art having changed at Manet. So the idea in Foucault being that there are these geniuses who have these epistemic breaks, but you're saying that this epistemic break might have happened before and is less French-centric, or are you also saying that these things are common throughout history and it's not so dramatic?
Well, I think what I've just said, I think they, obviously the interaction between fresh artistic creation and looking at the work of the past is something that you could look at in any historical context and you'd find something interesting. But I do think that there is a special, and of course Foucault is a good example who highlights exactly what I've just been saying, the impact of perhaps the museum being a place that the artist thinks of as their school rather than the academy and the practice, for example, of drawing from casts of ancient sculptures. So another thing that happens, which is sort of quite interesting, is there is a sort of a switch, I think, in this period from the kinds of models that people, that art students work with from 3 dimensions to two-dimensional, to painting actually being much more important, whereas in previous generations, drawing from sculpture is very crucial. That would be something that would be interesting to look at further.
My question was partly answered, I think, by an earlier one, but that group, the Brotherhood, when they got together, what was it they saw in each other? What were they producing at that time that brought them together and that they became the Pre-Raphaelites?
It's a fairly extraordinary thing, because actually most of them hadn't really made very much work at all. I mean, Rossetti didn't make his first oil painting until after they started. They got together. And Millet and Hunt had done 1 or 2 each. So, I mean, I think it is ideas. It's this sort of ferment of ideas that they get interested in. It's the things they're reading. They have, one of the first things that they did in their association was put together a thing they called the List of Immortals, which were all of the writers, artists, and actually some scientific and political figures from the past whom they really admired. So it's shared experiences that sort of brings them together. Now, why did it work with those 7 young people when, obviously students everywhere do that kind of thing, get together and talk a lot and do whatever else they do. That's perhaps an unfathomable, but one thing that is really extraordinary about the group is how when they get together, it raises all their game. So everybody does something, all of a sudden is able to make something that's kind of a kind of step change ahead, better than what they've been doing before. And some of the minor figures associated with the movement are able to make a very, fascinating, wonderful, complex works of art when they're in contact with this, when maybe otherwise they had been sort of going along in a rather plodding way. So there is something galvanizing about the way they get together, and I mean, it's partly a social thing. They enjoy talking to each other, but that's the best answer I can give. There's something unrecoverable and unfathomable about it.
Could I abuse the introducer's privilege? What interests me is the interrelationship between, you mentioned it in relation to Burne-Jones, industry and Pre-Raphaelites. So there's a kind of Oxford Pre-Raphaelitism, but there's also the Mancunian, Birmingham, Liverpool, and it's new art, new money, old art, old masters, old money, English aristocracy, mercantile wealth, whose disposition. And it's a really interesting kind of tension between those kind of patterns. And that, the kind of moment for me where they both came together was actually in the 1857 Manchester Fine Arts exhibition.
Yes.
Where there was, Botticelli's work put on display. There were, I think, they probably misattributed, but they counted some of the regional Pre-Raphaels. There were, the great works that were housed in the stately homes of the English aristocracy were pulled out into the public realm. The first kind of blockbuster exhibition that the world had ever seen. But the audience for it was, not predominantly, but was largely the general public. And I'm wondering about what's the relationship in terms of the way in which that Italian cultural imaginary sort of dragged its way through from the kind of mercantile, civic-orientated Florentine city commune renaissance to that kind of industrial, independent, thriving, civic pride-orientated industrial north with its new wealth. And whether that was a dialogue that the Pre-Raphaelite painters were kind of conscious of, because their early patrons and collectors were predominantly mercantile-orientated.
Yeah, early and late, early and continuously. And sometimes, I mean, one of the major collectors, F.R. Leyland, was referred to conspicuously as, like a Venetian merchant prince. I mean, so that there's a lot of consciousness among those new patrons of being, consciously emulating the Italian patrons of the Renaissance, and that's another quite interesting feature. But I think in general that the coming together of traditions of connoisseurship, which might be associated with the past and with past social situations, and a very interesting influx of people who have a new kind of interest in collecting and travel, and in looking at works of art. I mean, there's also a huge explosion, of course, in travel writing and in writing about this kind of art, which the experience, travel becomes much more possible for people at different levels of society. So I think that is actually a very important feature. And the Manchester Art Treasures exhibition of 1857 is very important for, it actually has, both modern painting and old masters together, and allows people to compare and contrast in a way that really wasn't really possible in other contexts.
In modern French art at the time. What about the Nazarenes in Germany, who have obvious things in common with the Pre-Raphaelites? Were there many channels of communication between the two?
Yes, so the Nazarenes were their sort of heyday period, possibly a little bit earlier in the earlier 19th century, but they share much of the interest in earlier Italian art. German painters who went to Rome and practiced kinds of painting that they took direct inspiration from earlier art than people would normally look at. Now, the Pre-Raphaelites group was certainly aware of this, and through one of their members, who I haven't really talked about today, Ford Madox Brown, who was slightly older than the Pre-Raphaelite brothers, but very much in contact with them and a mentor for them. Brown had spent a bit of time in Rome and had met some of the Nazarene artists. So whether or not the Pre-Raphaelite artists actually knew a lot of Nazarene work, they did know about the stories about that group and so forth. And of course, another very important channel, printmaking and book illustrations, extremely important for the Nazarenes and German artists of that earlier 19th century period. And the Pre-Raphaelite artists were avid print collectors. Rossetti just went mad for collecting prints. He'd, sort of buy up anything he could find. So I think they knew that imagery that way.